I'm Sarah White from Euroweek. I'm here at the 9th Annual Islamic Finance Summit in London with Mukhtar Hussain, Global CEO of HSBC Amana. Welcome.
Thank you, Sarah.
Mukhtar, do you believe the Islamic finance industry can continue to match the growth rates it has seen in other years?
I think obviously the industry has historically grown at quite a fast clip, albeit from a relatively small base. I think going forward, the economic conditions are challenging and the Islamic industry absolutely will be impacted by that. So I suspect that growth rates will be less than they were in previous years, but still will outstrip the level of growth that you'll see in the conventional industry.
How has the crisis shaped this market's development, and do you think it will have long-lasting effects on the future of the industry?
Well, I think a bit of both. I think the crisis has brought home to the Islamic finance industry the need to look very carefully at issues surrounding risk management, to look again at how they're developing new products and innovating in a different market context. So it's allowed the Islamic financial industry perhaps to look very carefully at what it will need to do to play a more prominent role going forward. Absolutely, it's been impacted, but I think this does provide for an opportunity for the industry to grow in size and to grow in scale going forward.
You've spoken about the lack of cohesion across the Islamic finance industry. How can cohesion be achieved?
Well, I think to some extent that cohesion must come through more global interaction, and we've already seen initiatives within the Islamic financial industry in terms of the bodies that set standards. So IOFI has been right at the forefront of that, the IFSB. Those have been important initiatives. But I think what we've got to do is to make sure that beyond the industry bodies, there's actually better dialogue and greater cooperation between the players in the industry, because they all can contribute to more cooperation across borders and more participation in risk and more sharing of opportunities.
Are banks and other financial institutions and trade bodies doing enough to promote Islamic finance and also to take advantage of some of the opportunities they are now presented with?
Well, I think more needs to be done. I think at the level of institutions, they clearly need to look very carefully at their risk management processes. They need to look at research and innovation. They need to look at their business and operating models to adjust them to the circumstances that the industry currently faces. I think clearly at a macro level, there's significant change potentially in the regulatory framework, both in terms of accounting standards and capital adequacy guidelines. And all of those factors will shape how the industry will be able to respond. But it's an opportunity for the industry to grow in size and scale going forward.
And what about HSBC? How are you planning to take advantage of these opportunities?
Well, I think HSBC benefits from being a global institution, and that's meant that we've been able to look very carefully at how we grow our footprint, particularly in the emerging markets, particularly in Asia, where we see growth prospects as being strong and robust, and it allows us to invest in our business there going forward, and we're optimistic about both the domestic opportunities within Asian countries and excited about intra-regional growth across Asia.
You mentioned Asia. How important is Asia for the development of the Islamic finance industry?
Well, historically, I think Islamic finance has always been predominantly a Middle Eastern-focused business, and that's quite rightly so, because the industry was born in the Middle East. It's got the largest scale and size in the Middle East. But I think Asia has an important role to play, and I think in Malaysia particularly, we've seen intellectual leadership of the industry emerge. We've seen a very strong regulator who's done an awful lot to promote and develop the industry. We've seen important initiatives beginning to occur in Indonesia, and we're beginning to see a lot of interest in the wholesale markets, particularly in Hong Kong and Singapore and Japan, and the retail markets. So there's a lot of activity across the Asian spectrum.
In terms of international fundraising, are we going to see an increase in Sukuk issuance or a revival of Sukuk issuance across Asia and the Middle East this year?
Well, I think that's, Sarah, really a function of confidence in the markets, and clearly the events of the last few months in particular have been challenging, but this does provide an opportunity for the industry to look very carefully from the lessons learnt, and also to try and to focus on driving issuance both at the sovereign level, which I think is important, at the corporate level and at the project level, because there will be demand for finance. There's no question that Islamic finance has a role to play in the provision of liquidity. But obviously it can only do that once investors are confident on the structures that they're investing in, there's clarity in the legal structures around enforceability, and perhaps there's greater confidence about recovery, which we hope will manifest itself going forward. So I think, the Sukuk market will grow. Probably that growth will be focused out of Asia because clearly the demand is there. In the Middle East, I think sovereigns will continue to look at opportunities of issuing in the market, and the infrastructure opportunity in the Middle East is still very significant.
Do you believe we'll see a new tier of clients from the US or Latin America, for example, tapping into the Sukuk market?
I think it's fair to say that I think more and more people have become aware of the prospects of issuance. Clearly, GE is an example of that, having issued in the marketplace. I think more and more companies are looking at the options of tapping into the pool of investors from the Islamic space. So as awareness of the industry grows, as more issuers come into the market, as Islamic finance becomes a part of the funding program of the bigger corporate issuers, that can only represent good news for the industry. But we're still in the early stages of growth, but at least there is an awareness of the opportunity, and more corporates, we believe, are looking carefully.
Can Islamic finance bridge some of the gaps that have been left by conventional financing, for example, in the syndicated loan market or in project financing?
Well, I think Islamic finance can play a role. I don't think Islamic financing today is of a sufficient scale to step into the shoes of conventional financing, simply because it's a relatively small industry. But I think what Islamic financing can do is provide a liquidity pool which can be utilized, particularly in areas such as infrastructure, where there are real assets and there are real economy flows which lend themselves naturally to Islamic finance structures. I think the other thing that's really very important is that I think it is critical in the Middle East, as is the case now in Asia, that domestic capital markets grow, so that funding isn't just a function of availability in the bank market, but actually funding is much more a function of availability across different markets, and that includes the capital market.
Do you think there's room for the local capital markets in the Middle East and Asia to develop further, and how can that be achieved?
Well, I think, Sarah, we're in the early stages of this, and certainly if you look at the Middle East, I think the success that particularly has occurred in Saudi Arabia is a good example of issuance in a domestic market, issuance in domestic currency, and I think the Saudi authorities to be applauded for their actions in developing a domestic capital market where important issuers like SABIC and SEC have issued successfully, because I think that actually shows signs that can be undertaken elsewhere. And of course in Malaysia there's been a history of successful issuance over many years, because there's been a market which has been reliant on domestic liquidity, and that's important for the industry to develop.
But can it truly become a cross-border market, so not just limited to Saudi Arabia, for example?
Well, I think there's every reason that over time those flows that start in domestic markets become cross-border flows, and those cross-border flows are stimulated by confidence in the issuers and confidence that investors can achieve appropriate returns. I think that's something that we would all like to see happen in the industry.
Looking at the Islamic finance industry as a whole, are there any particular countries that you're very excited about?
Well, for HSBC, Amana has been a very successful business over the 12 years since its existence. We've been excited by the opportunities in the Middle East, and particularly in Saudi Arabia, which is probably the world's most important market today by size. We're excited by what we're doing in Malaysia, where Bank Negara has allowed us to develop a subsidiary which has considerable potential. We're excited by what we see in Indonesia, particularly with the development of the Sukuk market there and the innovation around retail tranches. So there's a lot of activity in the marketplace, and HSBC is pleased to be involved at the forefront of the industry, whether that be in the Middle East or in Asia.
Finally, Mukhtar, what are your biggest concerns for this industry?
Well, I think the industry has to learn some lessons out of the global financial crisis, particularly around the issue of risk management, particularly about how it can deal with liquidity issues, how it can better codify and make sure that going forward some of the lessons that have been learnt in this crisis can be appropriately applied so the industry strengthens its foundations on the regulatory and risk side. I think it's got work to do in terms of driving innovation and driving research and development. Those are important features for the industry to be meaningful to a wider audience of customers. And I think development of people talent, I think that's actually quite critical because we need people in this industry to stimulate and sustain its growth.
Mukhtar, Hussain, thank you very much.